Good morning, Boker Tov, Sabah al-Khir. It's Wednesday, November 12th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 768 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, the White House hosted a reportedly reformed al-Qaeda leader, and I must admit, it kind of creeped me out. Not kind of, not a little. It creeped me out a lot, actually. Look, I'm not saying we should never give people a second chance. And I'm not saying that people can't change, but I will just note here that it's probably too soon to know about whether Ahmed al-Shara is in fact a reformed jihadist. I hope the White House knows what it's doing here, because if it doesn't, we've just platformed the jihadist who was not too long ago the leader of the al-Qaeda branch known as the Nusra Front. The man gave himself the nom de guerre, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, because he wants to liberate the Golan Heights. And it looks like he still wants to do just that. We have dropped sanctions against him, and we've empowered him at a time when the Middle East is going through some rapid, massive change. We have one chance to get this right, folks, as I see it. So here goes nothing. Our guest this morning is Seth Frantzman, a colleague here at FDD and a senior Middle East correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. He's based in Jerusalem, and few have tracked the post-October 7th realities in Israel as close as Seth has. He's even the author of one of the first books on this conflict, titled The October 7 War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. I've got it right here on my bookshelf. Today, we're going to dive into the recent IDF reports on the gaps in Israel's investigations of October 7th. We're going to explore talks of a potential UN peacekeeping mandate in Gaza. And if we're feeling spicy, we might even touch on developments in Iraq, Syria, Iran, and beyond. But first, a few thoughts and some headlines from yours truly. Yesterday was an important day in Israel. It was the day that Minister for Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer stepped down from government. I first met Ron more than a decade ago. He was an advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The way that he explained Israel's raucous politics and the way he explained Israel's evolving role in the region, well, it made me a better analyst. I felt smarter after every time we met. As Netanyahu evolved as a prime minister, Ron Dermer evolved too. He was named ambassador to the United States in 2013, just as Barack Obama's Iran nuclear deal began to take shape. Ron put up one hell of a fight to thwart the JCPOA, and while he couldn't prevent the deal from coming into force, he did lay the predicate for Trump to ultimately dismantle it in 2018. Dermer left Washington in 2021, intending to leave public life, but he was soon back at Netanyahu's side because Israel was at war. Ron helped Bibi navigate some of his biggest challenges over these last 2 years. The hostage families were rough on Ron, but from what they never understood was that Dermer was aiming high. He was trying to win the war and get the hostages back, and he ultimately did just that. If you ask me, the state of Israel owes him a debt of gratitude. Mr. Ambassador, I wish you luck in your future endeavors, but to be honest, I don't think luck will have much to do with it. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, French President Emmanuel Macron hosted Palestinian Authority President Altakaker Mahmoud Abbas. The pair met in Paris yesterday. The purpose of their meeting was to discuss the Gaza ceasefire. Before I proceed, let's remember who we're dealing with here. Macron, the French leader who foolishly chose to reward Hamas and recognize a Palestinian state in September, and Mahmoud Abbas, the 89-year-old PA chief who's currently serving the 20th year of a 4-year term. Now for the zinger. After their meeting, Macron announced that Paris will launch a joint committee with the PA that will help draft a new Palestinian constitution with the guy that is now 20 years into a 4-year term. That is some serious merde de cheval, if you'll excuse my French. Headline 2, the Houthis may be hitting pause on their attacks against Israel and Red Sea vassals, keyword being might, of course. In an undated letter to Hamas, the Iran-backed terrorists out of Yemen said they stopped their aggression, but their fingers remain on the trigger. If the Gaza ceasefire breaks down and Israel resumes fighting in the Gaza Strip, the Houthis will pick up right back where they left off. At least that's what we understand. The Houthis have not claimed an attack since the ceasefire began on October 10th. Instead, they've been targeting workers from the United Nations. I guess that's a change and a better one. I don't know. Basically, as my colleague and Britain's former ambassador to Yemen has said, we're talking about Edmund Fitton Brown here, said nothing's resolved with the Houthis. These goat herders that are armed with Iranian ballistic missiles will continue attacking Israel and international shipping whenever they feel like it. And apparently right now they don't. Headline 3, Iran said it dismantled a spy network linked to Israel and the United States. According to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, the network was broken up after months of surveillance. Very little in the way of detail beyond that here, folks. The IRGC's intelligence just said that the operation took place in, quote, a number of provinces, end quote. I get the distinct sense that the regime is just paranoid, but I don't know, maybe there's more. Tehran is cracking down everywhere. Last month, the regime strengthened penalties for people convicted of spying for Israel or the United States, and it has already executed several people accused of spying. This is all going down in the wake of that 12-day war between Iran and Israel back in June, and the regime, oh, it's freaking out. And I don't mind that at all, so pass the popcorn. Bonus headline 4, Israel continues to arrest citizens in Judea and Samaria who were attacking Palestinians. Look, I'm just going to say this, and I don't think it's particularly controversial. Not all settlements are created equal. Some should probably become part of Israel, some probably not. And I'm not here to tell you which one is which. But the one thing that I don't want to see is extrajudicial violence from either side. If you're at war, let your army fight. If you're not at war, your army doesn't fight. Individual citizens are expected to respect this in a sovereign state. That's how normal countries behave. So enough of this unsanctioned violence in the West Bank. Israel needs to get a handle on the chaos in Judea and Samaria pronto. All right, enough hot air from me. Let's get some hot air from someone else. Let's bring on Seth Frantzman. Welcome to the FTD Morning Brief, Seth Frantzman.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, let's get down to it. Let's talk about what Israel has and hasn't done to investigate the failures of 10/7. Where are we right now?
Well, Israel was basically involved, as you said, it is still involved in a multi-front war. So there was a 2-year war. It was very difficult. And then there was a ceasefire. And during the war, the IDF tried to have a whole bunch of kind of quite narrow probes into all sorts of parts of the conflict in terms of the lead up to October 7th, what went wrong on that day, and then what went wrong with certain units like the Navy, or what happened at the Nova Festival where hundreds of people were killed. There were 25 different probes looking at apparently 41 different battles. All that happened under the former IDF Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, who was the guy who was in charge of the IDF on October 7th. And sometimes people might say, institutions are not always good at kind of investigating themselves. And I think what's happened now is that the new Chief of Staff and a new panel that was impaneled over the last 5 months or so, kind of an external probe run by high-level former officers, has now come in and interviewed dozens of people and commanders, and basically found that of the 25 probes that were done, 5 of them are considered totally unsatisfactory, and about 10 or 11 are considered kind of okay, but have a lot of problems. And so what this says is the IDF is investigating an investigation of an investigation. And obviously, it's going to keep having to, grow out the lens until you finally get a handle on what went wrong and start to hold some people accountable. And that was some of the critique, was that the first probes just were not harsh enough and didn't have enough conclusions in terms of what actually went wrong.
Sounds like a pretty Byzantine bureaucracy that investigates an investigation into an investigation. Okay. I guess we'll stay tuned on that. I'm glad to see that there seems to be some progress. But yeah, well, I mean, they need to actually start to hold people accountable. What's happening in Gaza right now? I know you spent a lot of time in the South over the last 2 years. You've done some work down there. How does the war look like it's playing out to you? And what do you make of these peacekeeping plans?
Well, Gaza's divided. Half of it is run by, Hamas, some form of Hamas. I mean, we'll have to remember most of Gaza, part of it's in ruins. 2 million people are living in the Hamas-controlled area because the IDF has never wanted to administer civilian life in Gaza. So the IDF controls the other half, and that's called the yellow line, which is a new line on a map. It goes along with lots of historical lines in Israeli history, right? There's a blue line, a green line, maybe a purple one. I don't know. Anyway, so there's a yellow line. The IDF basically is pulled back. It's sitting behind the line. It sometimes is finding tunnels and destroying terrorist infrastructure as it finds it. There are some members of Arab groups that are working with Israel. I guess you could call them armed groups or militias or something. So there's a few small groups like that are working with Israel. And then there's apparently 100 or so Hamas members that are trapped in a tunnel in Rafah that are within the Israeli area. And they're trying to get a deal now with the U.S. mediation to kind of get those guys to disarm and leave. And some have argued that that might be a model then for how the rest of Hamas is disarmed. I think there's a lot of lack of clarity there. And there's a lot of lack of clarity on how you get to bring in or inject a peacekeeping force into Gaza. Lots of countries support this ceasefire, but when you ask the countries, okay, pony up, send some troops, most of them don't actually want to send troops, like the UAE and reports have said that they're not interested. And then the countries that want to send troops are the countries that Israel probably doesn't really want involved, like Turkey. So you end up with a bit of a catch-22 here. And the United States and the Trump administration is working really hard to thread this needle. And there's a lot of talk about, more U.S. forces being involved, more U.S. commitment, more money, more basing. But in the end of the day, someone is going to have to go into Gaza, not kick the can down the road, disarm people, and do peacekeeping. And look, peacekeeping is a tough business. And we all know from experience in the Balkans or Somalia over the years, it's a tough business. Lots of countries don't want to do it. Some of the countries that want to do it are not friends of Israel.
Yeah, I got to say, I mean, I don't know anybody that wants to raise their hand to put their nationals on the front line in Gaza. I mean, I don't even think Gazans want to be in Gaza. So when you start to think about foreign nationals putting themselves in the line of fire, that sounds insane. I will tell you what else sounds insane. I saw reports today that the United States is mulling a base along the border between Gaza and Israel where they put 10,000 service members. That sounds nuts. And then I think maybe even, well, maybe not equally nuts. Maybe this sounds more sane. I understand that U.S. officials have actually met with the Abu Shabaab militia, trying to enlist them to maybe help. It's a little weird having the U.S. engage with a ragtag militia. All of this sounds kind of nutty to me, but I guess we'll keep watching. But I think your description of what's going on there is spot on. I want to ask you, you mentioned the blue line. That's the north, right? That's Lebanon. It looks like Israel's stepping up its strikes right now, and Hezbollah seems to be stronger. Israel's trying to weaken them again. Naim Qassem, the head of Hezbollah, came out and said that there will be a point where he has to respond to Israel's attacks. I'm not sure I see Hezbollah is as strong enough to strike back against Israel. The moment that happens is the moment that Israel, I think, unleashes. Is that your sense here? What are you watching in the north?
Well, there's a ceasefire that was signed back in last year, November, right? And that ended the conflict with Hezbollah because it was supposed to kind of give the Lebanese state a chance to reorganize itself, get a new president, get a new prime minister, which they did, and then get the Lebanese state to kind of finally disarm this group. And what the Lebanese state did was say, okay, well, let's start with the small potatoes. We'll disarm a few Palestinian groups in some camps. And we'll do it with the agreement of the Palestinian Authority. And that went fine because they were in agreement. Well, when the government of Lebanon said, okay, let's deal with Hezbollah, what happened is what we all expected to happen, which is Hezbollah said no. And then, as we can see from the statements, they keep saying no, and they keep saying they're going to resist Israel, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what Israel has done is try to kind of push the envelope in terms of rewriting the rules of the engagement there, which is doing what Israel used to do in Syria during the campaign between the wars, which is carry out a whole bunch of precision airstrikes basically every day since last year. And those precision airstrikes hit cars and motorcycles, and they kill Hezbollah members, basically, not too many other people or civilians. So it's precision. But as Hezbollah is saying, listen, one day we're going to have to respond. Now, there's a big wiggle room between the two of those equations. But the question is, Israel is sending, reservists home, and I don't think anyone really wants another conflict in the region. So the U.S. has sent officials to Lebanon again and again and again, trying to get the government to prod them to do something. And as we all know, I guess, from back in the Reagan years, trust but verify, right? So the government talks in Lebanon, but they don't seem to do much. And I think that's really the big problem. Hezbollah is used to the fact that it can sit and wait for 5 or 10 years, and everyone forgets about it, and then it just stays there.
Yeah, and I got to say, this is sort of the irony. You got the Lebanese government right now ripping Israel a new one on a regular basis, right? Mm-hmm. Slamming Israel for attacking in Lebanese sovereign territory. But yet the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, are not doing a thing to prevent Hezbollah from growing stronger. So essentially, Israel is doing the Lebanese government's dirty work and then getting slapped around for it. So, I mean, thanks for nothing, guys. I mean, it's truly kind of, it's an insane arrangement that we have, but it's the only thing that's keeping both Lebanon relatively safe and keeping Israel relatively safe, but you do get a sense that we're maybe on the cusp of something more ugly. Okay, speaking of things that are more ugly, talk to us about those Shiite militias in Iraq. I guess the ones in Syria are not really operating any longer, and I guess that's the good news. The bad news is, at least from what I understand, the ones in Iraq are arming up. They're getting more weapons sent to them by way of Iran. Of course, they share a border. It's easier for the Iranians to send weapons over there. But it looks like they're prepping Iraq to be the next major front in this war, if there is to be a next major front. As we always have seen from the Iranian regime, they fight Israel to the last Arab. They seem to be doing that with the Iraqis right now, or at least intending to. Do I have this right, or is there something else going on?
I think it's a bit of both worlds. Look, Iraq is a complicated country. It's a big country. It had an election this week, and I think around 20 million Iraqis were able to vote, and they say about 50% of them were turned out or something like that. Among those voters, Kurds actually turned out very high levels, which is good because the Kurdish region is pro-Western and pro-American and against these militias. Sunnis turned out to vote as well, and then the Shiites. And the Shiites are in some ways, it's a good thing. They're kind of broken up into a bunch of pieces of little parties. Some of those parties are, as you noted, these militias. So what happens in Iraq is you have Iranian-backed militias. Some of the militias date even back to the 1980s. These militias like Kataib Hezbollah or Badr or Qais Khazali's Asayib al-Haq, the militias tend to have thousands of guys in the militia, and then they have a political party that's part of the militia, just like Hezbollah does in Lebanon. It's the same Iranian model. The problem with Iraq is that during the war on ISIS, the militias got a boost from the Iraqi government and became part of something called the Popular Mobilization Forces or units. And that became a huge kind of national guard that became part of the Iraqi paramilitary state, similar to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran. And that is obviously part of an Iranian plot to kind of, gobble up and swallow Iraq like a kind of anaconda, the way Iran tends to eat up countries in the region, right? So we see a similar model, in Yemen, Lebanon, what have you. Now, your question was, well, are they getting stronger? Well, the militias had, 100,000 or more men under arms back in the height of the ISIS war. They were already getting Iranian ballistic missiles. They got drones. They've used drones and missiles, rockets against American forces in Iraq, against Kurds. They used to flood into Syria. I think they've had their wings clipped a bit. And part of that's just because of their own infighting and their own whining and complaining about salaries, because the militia guys are getting older and they want to retire on state salaries and they don't want to go out and fight as much anymore. And that's actually good for us, because the less that they want to fight and the more they want to bicker about salaries from the state and retirement, the less they're going to be willing to go off on a jihad or whatever and kill people. So I think the problem is we have to look after the elections and we have to see, okay, how well did Badr and Qais Khazali's group and all these little militias, how well they do in the elections, and how much will they continue to siphon off resources from the state and create a parallel state within a state? And the good news might be that if Kurdish groups and the Kurdistan region and Sunni groups and those have performed well in the elections, working with Americans afterward and U.S. policymakers, we might be able to check the power of the militias a bit. It's not going to be 100% because they have a lot of power. And Iran is right there next door. And America's, pretty far away.
Yeah. It's funny. As I'm hearing you talk about, these guys wanting to retire, and just thinking, like, do we just ship a whole bunch of gold watches over there and set these guys off into their pensions? Is that the answer? It's kind of a silly thing to think about. But I guess, look, Iraq was the dog that didn't bark during that 12-day war. And I've said that multiple times on this program. I never understood why they didn't get into the action. So there's two ways of looking at it. One is they didn't have the stomach for it. The other is that the Iranians asked their militias to keep their powder dry for another fight. I guess we'll find out what's what, but I do think you're right that those elections are maybe going to be an indicator of what happens next. So let's pivot to Iran for a second. You're helping us go around the region. We a lot of us have been talking about this piece that came out in the New York Times the other day, and it reflects a lot of what we've been hearing out of Israel, that there is a possibility of another war between Iran and Israel. Is that how you see it? Do you think we're on the cusp of that? What's the likelihood in the next month, 6 months, year? I mean, how do you game this out?
I think the Trump administration is invested in that ceasefire, and they're very proud of it. And we have to remember the Trump administration likes to take credit for having solved, I think it's 7 or 8 or 9 conflicts around the world. So
and this one for 3,000 years, it's all over, right? Yeah,
exactly. So I just think we have to remember the Trump administration invested in the peace deal with Iran, or the ceasefire deal, the Gaza thing, the ceasefire there, and also probably not heating up the Houthi front or Lebanon. So I think it's plausible that, we're going to hear lots more reports, that if Iran doesn't do X, Israel's going to bomb them. And the goal of those reports, I think, is to get the Iranians, to play ball or not go crazy and stop, building as many missiles or maybe return to talks with the nuclear program. Now, the Iranians are saying they're not going to do that. So, there's going to be an impasse for the next year or so. And I guess also the question is going to be whether or not, Israel feels that a red line or another red line is being crossed. And then the question is, will Israel choose to do that again, another strikes or whatever, and whether the Trump administration can have that off, or whether the Trump administration says, okay, fine, here's a green light, we don't really care. So those are the question marks.
Yeah, I think, and for me, I guess the big question mark is how many missiles does Israel allow Iran to accumulate? Those ballistic missiles, the ones that did immense damage to Israel. The Israelis are watching. The Iranians are providing new missile parts and missile components, as well as new air defenses, as we understand it. And so that means the Israelis may need to get in there and clean up a little bit again. But the moment they do that is the moment those missiles start flying into Israel again, which nobody wants to see. So it's this kind of delicate dance that we're watching. And I don't know how to game it out. It sounds like, I guess, you and I are kind of in the same place right now. Before I let you go, the mood in Israel right now, you live in Jerusalem. That's where you're coming from right now. I know that everybody that I talk to, they're welcoming the quiet. It's a little bit of that sigh of relief that everybody's been breathing, having Hadar Golden's body return home to rest. There's only 4 hostages left, but the bodies of hostages, this is like a huge monkey off the back of Israelis. But is that the mood? Is it just all relief? Are they talking about what happens next? I mean, we are still at war, are we not? It is still a multi-front war. Even though Israel's not fighting as hard as it once was, reservists are going home. That's all good, but this thing is not over. So what's the mood?
I think that's right. I mean, look, I think people are just finally getting to breathe out after, 2 years of conflict, everything being tense, and many people, wanting to see the hostages home, many families divided by people being, in the reserves for much of the war. So people are, I think, taking a breath finally. They know that next year there's probably going to be elections. They know there's lots of other conflicts that could happen. And so I think they're just, there's still some people, a lot of people in a bit of a trance, still with a lot of trauma. And I think they're going to need a bit of time to overcome that and kind of wake up, like in one of those movies where people wake up from the cryogenic sleep or something, where they've been asleep for 20 years or something on some mission, and it takes them a bit of time to finally sit down and say, okay, now what? So I think that it's going to take time. We really don't know what we don't know until the next 6 months or so.
Interesting way to put it. Cryogenically frozen in conflict for the last 2 years. Wow. All right. We're going to leave it there. Thank you, Seth Frantzman, for joining us today on the FTD Morning Brief. All right, always good to talk to that guy. Here's what FTD has on tap for you today. FTD's Jonathan Saya has a new piece in Real Clear World about Tehran's unraveling. The dams supplying the city are only at 14% capacity. Sinkholes are opening up in residential neighborhoods. The city only had 7 days of clean air last year. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said last month that moving the capital out of Tehran is a necessity. Get that? They want to move the entire capital. Problem is that the regime is just too incompetent and too corrupt to pull it off. By the way, how do you get millions of people to just leave where they live? Just sounds insane. Anyway, Jonathan said that Tehran's collapse isn't just a story about a city crumbling under its own weight. It's a sign of the overall reckoning that's coming for the Islamic Republic. And that reckoning, if you ask me, can't come soon enough. Over in National Review, FTD's David May and Ben Cohen reflect on the 50-year-old UN absurdity known as the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Blah, that's a mouthful. The committee was born in 1975 on the same day that the UN passed its infamous Zionism is racism resolution, which was of course repealed. Today, the committee provides a platform for Hamas apologists and anti-Semites. David and Ben say it's time to shut down this rotten UN body once and for all. And I say harumph to that. Finally, my colleague Sinan Jidi and his star intern William Duran published a piece in the Greek outlet Kafi Merini about an election shock in Cyprus that might just redraw the map. The self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus just elected a liberal, pro-unification candidate, unseating the pro-Erdogan incumbent. This is good news. Sinan and William explained that peace could be back on the table and that the U.S.'s deal-maker-in-chief, President Donald Trump, should take note. But any deal that Trump brokers must lead to the total withdrawal of the 35,000 Turkish soldiers occupying the area. So how we say when I talk about Cyprus, end the occupation. Funny how nobody in the region talks about that occupation in Cyprus. Wonder why. All right, that's going to do it for today's FTD Morning Brief. This is the part of the show where I remind you that if you're looking for more FTD content, please visit our website, ftd.org, or take a look through our social media accounts. And yes, folks, I will remind you again that the end of the year is fast approaching, so you can still make a generous tax-deductible donation at ftd.org/invest. If you like this show, show us. We'll be happy to acknowledge. Anyway, that's it for today. So go home or go to work or whatever you're doing next. Tune in Friday for another episode of your favorite morning show. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FTD.